Context is perhaps the most fitting word to describe the Soulsborne genre, a condition of understanding how and why circumstances came to be before you can parse their meanings. Out of all the allegorical forces of the Dark Souls trilogy, between good and evil, the desires for power or for knowledge, and the fear of the unknown, the desires of fate and the futility of existence, as well as the value and the meaning of humanity, context is perhaps the most formidable foe, from the narrative's obfuscation of universal truths to the deliberate gameplay that emphasizes every action with purpose. Much like respect, context is not simply granted to you, but earned through hardship. Even outside the domains of these games, the context of Dark Souls manages to pervade discussions of other games, no matter how absurd, as its context is not limited to one series. In a manner of speaking, one does not finish Dark Souls when he or she completes the game. Its impact on the player remains until some closure is found one day when everything finally comes together. It's for this very reason that until I had completed this series, as well as reflecting on the years I've listened to others share their stories and their perspectives, have I come around to appreciate the resolution of that long journey. Given the emphasis here on context, it should go without saying that if you haven't played the trilogy of Dark Souls games, you probably shouldn't watch this video. As much as I believe you can't spoil these games because they are heavily reliant on hearsay, I state this information up front for those sensitive. Another important detail is that this video will not cover Demon Souls and Bloodborne, although I have played the former a long time ago thanks to an ex-stepbrother. Emulation nor PlayStation's Now service were neither fitting substitutes, yet I am familiar with both titles from various channels. Examples from these games will be used, sparsely, to reference ideas inherited from one series to another, and it's thanks to channels like Mathewmatosis and Joseph Anderson that I feel confident in discussing them. One other important note before we can begin is that I'm going to focus my attention on the original Dark Souls release and the Skull of the First Sin edition. The remastered version of the original is not something I desire for $20, so you'll have to forgive me as I will be using the original release footage that doesn't like my widescreen settings even with DS Fix. Finally, before we can begin, I want to illustrate the structure of this video as I believe it will make more sense if properly explained. The first section is broken up between two major issues I have with the Soulsborne games, namely the emphasis on difficulty along with the discussion into inherent storytelling problems from these games. Afterwards, this video will examine the merits, the drawbacks, and the alterations from each entry as well as their DLCs, and it's these sections which will be heavily gameplay focused with some narrative discussions. Instead of a level-by-level examination common to these critiques, my intentions are to use enough examples to get the point across without being exhaustive. Tim Schafer's rule of 3 is enough for most games to get the point across, so why not the same for a game analysis video? At the summit of this video, when all the series heights have been scaled, this final section will summarize my thoughts on how the series has changed, what has been gained or lost with time, and what remains yet unexplored. Bearing these thoughts in mind, my goal is not to unravel every mystery that will forever remain in the dark, nor to demystify the magic behind these beloved games. It is but one man's journey, as well as his many ponderings, to come to understand what compels him to seek further adversity when all meaning seems to elude him.
What could possibly await us? And yet we seek it insatiably. Such is our fate.
If there is any quality of the Soulsborne genre that precedes its name, it's undeniably its reputation as a difficult game. As much as marketers of Bandai Namco, games media outlets, and players emphasize the more frustrating elements, it's often overlooked how accommodating these games can be for those observant. Difficulty and accessibility are two concepts that do not always have to be antagonistic towards each other, and the Dark Souls series is a prime example of how to accommodate both without marginalizing the value of either one. However, this emphasis on describing these games as only insurmountable challenges is largely reductive. More importantly, this conversation sets an expectation that future games must be even more difficult to inherit the series' legacy. The problem with this line of thinking is, in reality, It's always the first Soulsborne game you play that is the hardest, and the other games are made easier as well as they are colored by your first exposure. Now this virgin effect is not some great underlying truth only about the Soulsborne titles, as it is a description for any seasoned player who plays many games. As a result, difficulty is often a relative discussion that is hard to find empirical evidence to support. However, I want to illustrate there is often a bias associated with every player's first experience, by showcasing several statements about what these 4 players think is the most important element from these games.
One thing I want to talk about before we even really get into the game is the stamina meter. So, this is one of the unique aspects of Demon's Souls, and I think not a lot of people appreciate just how important it is to Demon's Souls, the stamina meter. In fact, this is a bit of hyperbole here, but basically I think the stamina meter is Demon's Souls in a way. Now, a stamina meter, of course, is not an idea that's brand new, it's not an innovation in and of itself, but just the way it was balanced is really, really good. You can see when I can attack maybe 6 or 7 times before it has to reset, which is a reasonable amount. But then there's the way it plays into your shield usage and your sprinting and all that kind of stuff. When your shield is up, you're going to regenerate stamina at a lower rate. Combat for a melee character then has a nice ebb and flow to it, where the idea is to drop your shield and only lift it when necessary, because otherwise you're not going to get the stamina regen that you need to stay alive. I think the main way to appreciate the stamina meter in Demon's Souls is actually not by playing Demon's Souls, but by playing other games which have a stamina meter, because you'll often find that they're just not as well implemented as the one in Demon's Souls, at least I do anyway. So if you're playing another game with a stamina meter, just think about how that game would play if it had the Demon's Souls stamina meter, and I think in a lot of cases it would significantly improve the game. So I think of it as the little secret that made Demon's Souls successful personally, but of course that's all up for debate.
All 3 of these gameplay pillars feed into each other when you're trying to overcome the area. The boss is the final hurdle, and if it kills you, you are sent back to the bonfire and have to fight your way back there. So by fully exploring the level, you can often open shortcuts that make it so you can get back to the boss faster to try again, or you might even discover a hidden bonfire closer to the fog door that makes it even easier. In combat, you can get better at fighting the enemies in each level, to the point that you can become so good that they don't pose any challenge to you. Once again, this means that you have a smoother time getting to the boss to try again. On top of all this is resource management. This would be a subcategory of Dark Souls gameplay that affects all of it. Specifically, healing resources tie intrinsically into exploration, combat, and bosses. The Estus Flask is your primary source of healing in Dark Souls 1. You have limited charges, and the only way to refill them is to return to the bonfire and rest. But this makes all the enemies in the level respawn in the exact same way as if you had just died and were sent back to the bonfire. This is the best mechanic in the entire series as far as I'm concerned, because it brings everything together. When you first start to explore an area, your flask charges dictate how far you can get. You're new and will make many mistakes, and that's what those charges represent. How many mistakes you're allowed to make before you run the risk of being kicked back to the bonfire. It's my opinion that everything else in the Soul series are added extras put on top of this foundation. You could take them all away, and the game would still be pretty good with just these 3 core features in the Estus Flask. Of course, the extras push the game from good to brilliant, but it's important to know that this is what I consider to be the heart of the series before moving onward, because Dark Souls 2 changes all of it.
Dark Souls. Where do I start? For the better part of a year, a huge part of my life has revolved around this game. If I could sum up how I feel about it in one video, then I wouldn't have 70 other videos dedicated to it. And if there's any one true testament to what this game means, then you should just look at the content and the community that has evolved around it. But essentially, Dark Souls, to me, is what a video game should strive to be, because games have the potential to be something that nothing else can. Not only can they put you in control of a character or a world, but they can give you an experience. They can use gameplay and interactivity to make you experience the world. Good games realize that you aren't just a viewer, you are a player. And carefully, very carefully, true games can be designed so that the player doesn't just witness the world around them, they experience it. A book can't do this, a movie can't do this. Sure, these mediums can make you empathize, but they can't make you experience. Only a game can do that.
We might as well start with a discussion of the health system, which I feel is the core building block of the Souls games, because it dictates the rhythm and structure of the gameplay and creates the weighty sense of challenge and difficulty the series is known for. Ironically, it's very easy to just make something hard. Making a game challenging, while also being fun, requires a very dense and carefully arranged interplay of mechanics. This is the tightrope games have to walk. How do you make a player feel challenged so that their success is a rewarding experience without making them feel overly punished or simply frustrated? This balance is difficult to execute. Souls games have no difficulty setting because there's almost no way to make the game easier without fundamentally altering the thing that makes the games fun. In a Souls game, you generally can only take a couple of hits before dying. Healing, therefore, is an important mechanic. How do you let the player gain health back? This is an important mechanic to talk about because it defines the flow of the rest of the ensuing game experience. Let's say there was no healing whatsoever, or you healed instantly without there even being an animation, or, as in Bloodborne, you could heal back damage you took if you retaliated quickly. These utterly change the rest of the mechanics and therefore the rest of the game experience because they change how the player is led to interact with them. The guy who gets to decide how players get health back actually is responsible for more of the game than the people who designed the levels in a weird way.
Demon's Souls turns its back on both of those ideas and cuts your health in half as soon as you die. As if that isn't enough, repeated deaths will increase enemy stats and eventually spawn additional black phantoms to make the stage even tougher. Now you might think this is a poor mechanic. There are some very sound, logical arguments against it. I'm not saying that every game should work this way, but hopefully you can understand that I find this refreshing for the simple fact that it's different from everything else. This, for me at least, was the real appeal of Demon's Souls. Time and again, they threw out the rulebook and just did whatever they felt like. These elements work better the more unknowns you go up against. In other words, the element of surprise is pretty important. Venturing into Demon's Souls felt like venturing into the unknown, not because it was narratively unpredictable, but because it was mechanically unpredictable. Even once you got used to the Souls series features, which were brand new at the time, it still made sure to throw curveballs at you on a regular basis. Lack of careful observation was punished. NPCs weren't always what they appeared to be. Bosses often had unique mechanics, and even the environments could be polar opposites of each other. In a 2009 interview about Demon's Souls, Miyazaki himself said, "When designing the bosses, I made sure that they would be varied and exciting. I prepared different gameplay and strategies for each one so that players didn't get tired of the same fight every time. We wanted to surprise players and encourage them to figure out different tactics, to think on their feet." It's been the better part of a decade since that interview, so it's fully possible that Miyazaki has changed his mind since then, but it's still a quote that resonates with me at least.
Again, these examples do not prove my initial statement that these games become progressively easier with more experience, yet I highlight these 5 videos because they display a wide range of what people think makes these games as great as they are. One individual can focus on a particular mechanic like the stamina system, the healing system, or the amount of health for enemies. Another person might focus on the interplay between major and minor gameplay systems like the Estus Flask, as well as dismiss the value of its narrative, whereas someone else thinks the narrative is what elevates these games beyond their mechanics. The last clip from Mathewmatosis is perhaps the most telling of preferential treatment, as the video laments how combat-focused the series has become, which can be summed up by his statement, "This is no longer a series where you outsmart your opponents," referring to a trap where arrows check your movements while in flight. It's a series where you press the roll button at the right time. People will always have their own opinions, and none of these opinions here are ones I disagree with, yet the disparity between these preferences should illustrate that as a series, the Soulsborne games face an uphill battle with their own audience. The purpose behind giving you all this information is to highlight that when it comes to these games, difficulty is not something most players consider as the most important. It's often the quality of the experience as well as what aspects they desire that matter the most. This goal is something that the developers also strive to create, as they prefer to think about the satisfaction rather than about the challenge from the obstacle. In an interview with Alex Donaldson before Dark Souls 3, director Hidetaka Miyazaki chooses his words carefully when discussing the difficulty. "Well, there were of course several moments where I had to stop things and take a step back and consider the difficulty," he says with a smile. "But it's not necessarily that I say, oh, this is too difficult. But instead the term I usually use is unreasonable. So that's the term I tend to use when I have these conversations with the development team." When you think about it, the difficulty in the Dark Souls franchise so far has been something that players have eventually been able to overcome. So when I show concern to the development team members, that's why the term I use is unreasonable. Basically, we don't want to go too far. It's about striking a balance. Unreasonable is a subjective word, which I imagine if you were able to prod the man further for insight, he could tell you more about what he meant. Yet the idea of balance is a quality you can see that is often overlooked. Traps are often, though there are some exceptions, foreshadowed well in advance, as well as being punishing to remind you of them. Dying in any one of these games often comes with a small benefit as well as a drawback. Notes litter themselves everywhere to help and to confuse players who are struggling. The summon signs for NPCs or other players comes with the caveat that other players can invade you, and if you summon help for a boss fight, that will give the boss a health bonus as well as fewer souls as a reward. There are dozens of other examples you could mention here. However, it should be obvious how often anything beneficial also has some consequence to counteract its effects for players who may or may not use these features. All too often people are quick to remember their failures or to focus solely on the consequences when the game always provides you the means to succeed, and this balance rarely favors one method of play over another. This is the balance I believe Miyazaki meant by his statement, and it's what should be discussed instead of how fair or unfair are these games. If the Souls series has proven anything, people will take a challenge no matter how impossible it may be, or how elusive is its significance. As much as the series has been critiqued to death for its gameplay, it's surprising how little these games have been discussed from a narrative standpoint. Perhaps from the fact that many people are left with too many important unanswered questions. If you have any experience playing these games, then you would understand why that is the case, because many answers are purposely withheld from you to generate speculation. The most interesting stories within these games are often generated by the player's imagination from item descriptions, which makes these narratives heavily reliant on group discussion, lore enthusiasts, or going into the game's code as well as perusing the many wikis available to obtain some coherent idea of the story. The question you must ask yourself when evaluating the merits of the storytelling is the following. Is this method a viable way to tell stories in games? And if so, why do other games like Destiny or Final Fantasy XIII suffer from the exact same issues that people praise in Dark Souls? Now, if you're an introvert like myself and do not like going outside of a medium to get necessary context for any story, then you will probably find this storytelling inherently flawed. If, however, you are some extroverted individual that likes piecemealing scraps of stories with others to create your own take, then you will probably love this style. This distinction is overtly simple, yet it speaks to the types of audiences that will resonate the most or the least with these games. My purpose in this section is to illustrate to the latter camp why these games' narratives are not compelling to people like me from objective storytelling issues that From Software has yet, and probably never will, fully address. These issues stem from 5 major problems with this narrative design: the legitimacy of cut content, the mistranslations from localization teams, the sparse plots in each game, the issues of clarity when it comes to seemingly synonymous terms, and the lack of internal consistency. Before we delve into how these problems apply to the Souls trilogy, and in case someone is watching who has no idea what these issues are, it would be better to illustrate these problems on a microcosm scale with the short story The Hills Like White Elephants by Ernest Hemingway. You don't have to pause the video if you do not want to read it, but it's available online for free and it only takes 5 minutes. Although these are 2 separate media, Hemingway's Iceberg theory of storytelling, or more known as the theory of omission, more on the topic soon, is reminiscent of Miyazaki's storytelling with emphasizing subtlety over direct information, which may be false if Miyazaki's intentions were to inhibit players' literacy to mirror his own childhood experience of not understanding English. In one interview with The Wired, Miyazaki answered the following question. The Soul series is known for environmental storytelling and implied lore, rather than a direct narrative players work through. What appeals to you about that approach? First of all, I don't dislike direct storytelling. People often seem to think that about my games. Actually, the truth is, I'm just not good at implementing direct narrative in my games. Another side is I want to leave the interpretation of the world's stories to the player. That's actually my biggest reason for focusing on environmental and subtle storytelling. Rather than the game itself automatically telling the story, the player gets more value from it when they themselves find out the plot from items or side characters they encounter in the world. For the purpose of this video, the iceberg theory is not only a useful visual metaphor to help illustrate these core issues, but also to explain how video games benefit from that style of storytelling. We should also keep in mind that when we are talking about storytelling, we have to separate the plot from the lore. The plot is in the foreground, much like a person in a portrait, whereas the lore is in the background, meant to provide additional details to the subject of the composition. Anyway, by the time you have listened to my ramble, you probably have read through the short story. So, did you realize the two characters were talking about getting an abortion? No? Well, if you did, you probably read the story before in a literature class, or you read the Wikipedia or Cliff Notes entries instead. The iceberg theory, as the visual demonstrates, is the idea that you should only draw attention to the most surface-level parts of a story by omitting details that draw readers to search for meaning below the surface. As Hemingway states in his book Death in the Afternoon, if a writer of prose knows enough of what he is writing about, he may omit things that he knows, and the reader, if the writer is writing truly enough, will have a feeling for those things as strongly as though the writer had stated them. The dignity of movement of an iceberg is due to only 1/8 of it being above water. A writer who omits things because he does not know them only makes hollow places in his writing. We can see this difference quite clearly in his short story. The whole first page's purpose is to draw attention to the fact that the American and the girl have something bothering them, while they are not openly discussing what that problem happens to be. It's only when the American implies everything tastes like licorice to her does she show any aggression towards him. Given the story is set at a train station somewhere in Spain and it refers to only one of them being an American, one could infer these two have not known each other for too long. In addition, the girl's ignorance of Spanish implies she might be from another country with this man on some romantic getaway, and their romance becomes the focal point about some, quote, simple operation. Now, we are never explicitly told what sort of operation it is, and that is a large part of the realism involved, as no one openly discusses taboo topics without some euphemistic language such as, quote, they just let the air in. However, we can infer that it is about an abortion from the description of the hills across the valley being white and infertile of trees, as well as the countryside being brown and dry. These images portray something once thriving, now dead. At the end, we're left wondering what was the resolution as the girl passive-aggressively states that she feels fine when it's obvious the problem wasn't resolved. Out of all the questions you probably have about this video, the most important one you are likely wondering is, what the hell does this story have to do about Dark Souls? It may not have dragons, high fantasy, or your Sun Bros, yet it does capture the appeal of these types of narratives, as well as their share of problems, because without any context, the story is indecipherable. Time is perhaps the most crucial one, as the story was written in the 1920s, so some of the language may sound strange in modern times. In addition, if the girl was actually pregnant, she shouldn't be drinking alcohol if she intended to keep the baby. Yet that information was not known at the time, whereas now... oh, maybe we haven't quite learned that lesson. Context is one of those ironic things where it never stays the same, and it often contradicts itself afterwards. It's something that changes with the times as well as with reiterations, which is apparent in the Souls trilogy, as the sequels have retroactively patched some of their looser threads. To illustrate this point with Dark Souls, let's take a simple example with the story of Gwyn's firstborn. No, it is not Solaire no matter how hard you imagine a headcanon. Perhaps as a result of his jovial nature and his fixation on being an Icarus symbol, Solaire was mistaken as Gwyn's offspring, whom many believe lost his deity status because he lost the annals of history, and people who propagated this misunderstanding from cut content or from mods wanted to have him link the fire to redeem himself as well as his, quote, father. The irony is that although Dark Souls 3 addressed this mistake, there is the correct interpretation in Dark Souls 1. The problem is a poorly translated item description, which showcases what happens when you leave mistakes in a narrative that relies on endnotes. Here's the source of the misunderstanding from the Ring of the Firstborn. Lord Gwyn's firstborn was a god of war, but his foolishness led to a loss of the annals and rescinding of his deific status. Today, even his name is not known. From this statement, it's easy to see why people were confused because the description suggests the firstborn foolishly lost the physical annals. However, if we examine the sunlight medal, it states something completely different. This symbol represents Lord Gwyn's firstborn, who lost his deity status and was expunged from the annals. But the old god of war still watches closely over his warriors. Instead of losing the physical annals, the firstborn is now lost to the annals because his name was erased due to losing his deity status. In addition, the fact that the symbol remains a badge of honor and it is associated to the firstborn must mean that Lord Gwyn values its significance, and that respect is reciprocated by the firstborn who places the sunlight blade on his father's coffin. One simple revision that addresses the problem would be, Lord Gwyn's firstborn was a god of war, but his foolishness rescinded his deific status from the annals. You still have no idea what foolishness led to his removal, and you only get glimpses in Dark Souls 3, but you now have a better understanding of the firstborn as well as his relationship with Lord Gwyn. This one example isn't the only one, as there is the cut content narrative of Oscar of Astura in Dark Souls, the mistranslations for the Pursuer in Dark Souls 2, as well as Bloodborne's many gender-related pronouns that omit the interpretation of female hunters. Sometimes these files are left in the game completely unused for data miners to extrapolate, or fans have to retranslate the lore from Japanese to get a better understanding. If these files are in the games, yet they are not coded, are they canonical even though you have to access them outside of the game? These are the larger problems that come with the speculative nature of the Soulsborne narratives, and it's nothing in comparison to the annoyance of seemingly synonymous terms used in-game. Giants include these figures from Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, yet Lord Gwyn, King Vendrick, and other seemingly gigantic people are not giants, and they cannot be called giants because humans shun them with prejudice like Yorm. Demons take all shapes and sizes, and they are often explicitly referred as demons, yet skeletons and specters are neither undead, hollows, nor demons. It's not as simple as in Demon Souls, where every non-human entity could be considered a demon because the whole game was about fighting demons. These issues might seem pedantic compared to others, but if you cannot refer to beings and creatures without clear distinctions, the whole logic behind these narratives falls apart before it ever gets started. Now, I understand mythologies do not have to be 100% consistent, as the ancient Greeks and Romans made gods out of anything. It's what significance they represent that matters more than internal logic. In fact, in spite of the issues I've illustrated, the one thing the Souls games have gotten right is using proper symbolic language that suits the gameplay as well as its themes to create a world open to interpretation. Coming back to the question I asked at the beginning about why Dark Souls gets away with its storytelling, it's easy to see how consistent these symbols are as they complement the gameplay and the setting. Bonfires, the Age of Fire, the Age of Dark, the Abyss, the Dark Soul of Humanity, Ash, Kiln of the First Plane, etc., etc. In contrast, Destiny suffers with its similar themes about the light versus the darkness because it is not consistent with the gameplay nor the sci-fi setting. Enemies have names like the Fallen, the Cabal, or the Hive, and players use ballistic and laser guns, melee weapons, and psionic abilities in addition to an unexplained entity called Light by Ghosts, granted from the Traveler to resurrect the Guardians. As for Final Fantasy XIII, which can be a fair comparison with how much narrative is hidden in the database, it relegates the narratives all through cutscenes, so you find yourself having to re-watch these scenes after reading the entries because the characters do not provide exposition. The Souls games are primarily gameplay focused through the item descriptions, which are questionable inclusions as we don't know how or why we can read boss souls or armor for details. It's often the location of these items as well as the environmental storytelling that provides more information. This last aspect manages to combine not only the exploration elements of the gameplay as physical rewards, but also the community-driven elements as everyone uncovers more of the world and the narrative together. Again, as much as I do not prefer this style of storytelling that relies on community involvement because I happen to be a social troglodyte in real life, my goal is to present the problems that the other side may or may not be capable of putting into words. Given how defensive most fans are about their lore or their headcanons, I cannot imagine why people would be afraid to critique these stories. As far as discussing the series' issues about plots, I will save that discussion for each individual game. Whether or not this framework is the best method of storytelling for video games or an elegant way to structure gameplay with the narrative, I leave that decision up to you if these pains are worth their insights.
You, conqueror of adversities. Give us your answer.